Did you know that the space race began not with peace, but with fear? What started as a battle for military dominance turned into humanity's greatest leap beyond Earth. Rockets once built for war carried the first satellites, the first astronauts, and eventually the first footsteps on another world. Tonight, we'll explore the entire history of the American space race. Before you settle in, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this kind of quiet storytelling truly helps you relax and unwind. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Share where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. I really enjoy reading what you write, and it's comforting to see people from all around the world gathering here, slowly winding down side by side, even though we're far apart. Now, make yourself comfortable. Dim the lights, and if you'd like, switch on a fan or a little white noise for that steady background hum that helps the world fade away. Let your breathing slow, let your body relax, and together we'll drift into tonight's story at an easy, gentle pace. Chapter 1. America's Space Foundation, establishing NASA and launching Explorer 1. The history of the American journey to space is a story of quiet beginnings, unexpected shocks, and a determination to achieve the seemingly impossible. It's a complex history that begins, like so many great technological leaps, with the necessities of war. The incredible achievements of the American space program, like landing a man on the moon, wouldn't have been possible without certain foundations being laid years before. You see, the deepest roots of the space race actually lie in the technology created by German scientists during the Second World War. Back then, they unveiled a true marvel of engineering called the V-2 rocket. This long-range guided ballistic missile was unlike anything the world had ever seen before. It could soar to the edge of space. Though it was a weapon, it showed a clear glimpse into the future, proving that vehicles could be launched far beyond the confines of Earth's atmosphere. As the war finally came to a close, both the United States and the Soviet Union recognized the immense potential held by this technology. They knew that securing these rockets and, even more importantly, the brilliant minds behind them was absolutely crucial. This fierce scramble set the stage for a new kind of rivalry that would eventually define the Cold War, a contest of technological might where dominance in space was perceived as translating directly to dominance on Earth. The United States acted quickly, launching a secret program they called Operation Paperclip. The goal was simple: bring German scientists to America to assist with the U.S.'s own rocket program. Among the most important of these recruits was a man named Wernher von Braun. He was the mastermind behind the original V-2 rocket. Von Braun and his team found a new home at the U.S. Army's Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. Here they adapted their detailed knowledge of ballistic missiles for what von Braun hoped would be a new, peaceful mission: the exploration of space. Von Braun eventually joined NASA as the first director of its Marshall Space Flight Center in 1960. By the end of the 1940s, the U.S. was definitely pouring resources into these various fledgling rocket programs. While military applications were still at the forefront, the potential for pure scientific exploration was becoming increasingly apparent. Experimental rockets were pushing higher and faster, making the dream of spaceflight feel closer to reality. The technology born from the ashes of war was now set to carry the hopes and dreams of an entire nation into the cosmos. The stage was set, but it was set for competition. America was determined to pursue space exploration, but it hadn't yet entered a true race. That all changed suddenly and dramatically on October 4th, 1957. That day began like any other. But it ended with a small metal sphere altering the course of history entirely. The Soviet Union had successfully launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, into orbit around Earth. This small, beeping basketball-sized object circling the planet marked the official start of the space race. It instantly transformed the Cold War into a cosmic competition. The successful launch of Sputnik profoundly shocked the world, and especially the United States. It was a clear, sudden demonstration of Soviet technological prowess that caught America completely off guard. The U.S. public and government alike were hit hard. The launch shattered the notion that America was technologically superior. It raised serious fears of a significant military gap because people reasoned if the Soviets could put a satellite into orbit so easily, they could just as easily launch nuclear weapons across continents. This realization sent genuine shockwaves through the government and the American public. The immediate response in the U.S. was intense. The United States rapidly accelerated its own space and missile programs, pouring resources into scientific research and education. There was a huge, renewed focus on science and mathematics in schools, with the government providing funding through the National Defense Education Act. The specific goal was to produce a new generation of scientists and engineers who could help America quickly catch up in this new race. But catching up wasn't easy. The previous year had seen some embarrassing setbacks for the U.S. efforts in satellite launches. Notably, the Vanguard rocket, which was intended to carry America's first satellite, exploded on the launch pad, becoming a fiery spectacle of failure. The U.S. needed a clear success to restore national confidence and prove it could compete. Just months after the initial Sputnik launch, America was ready to play its hand. On January 31st, 1958, the United States successfully launched Explorer-1, its first successful satellite, into orbit. This achievement marked America's official entry into the space race following the Soviet triumph. Explorer-1 was developed by the team led by Wernher von Braun. The satellite was launched aboard a Juno 1 rocket, which was a modified version of the Army's Redstone ballistic missile. This success was critical because, unlike Sputnik, which primarily served as a proof of concept, Explorer-1 carried scientific instruments. This strategic decision demonstrated America's commitment not just to matching Soviet achievements, but to advancing actual scientific knowledge. The most significant instrument on board was a cosmic ray detector designed to measure radiation levels in Earth's orbit. The mission proved to be far more successful than anyone had anticipated. As Explorer-1 orbited Earth, it made a groundbreaking discovery. The cosmic ray detector showed unexpected variations in radiation levels, providing the first evidence of what would later be named the Van Allen radiation belts. These belts are charged particles held in place by Earth's magnetic field. This discovery was a major scientific breakthrough that immediately highlighted the profound importance of space exploration for advancing our understanding of Earth and its environment. The success of Explorer-1 helped restore some of America's confidence after the earlier failures. It showed that the U.S. could definitely compete in space and, in some key areas, even surpass Soviet achievements. But the triumph of Explorer-1 also exposed a glaring issue. The U.S. lacked a unified strategy for its space exploration efforts. Different groups were handling different projects, and it was disorganized. The U.S. needed a way to harness all of its technological and scientific prowess under a single, coordinated roof. The answer came on October 1st, 1958. President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, which officially created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. NASA wasn't just a bureaucratic reshuffling. It represented a fundamental shift in how the United States would approach space exploration going forward. The new agency was given a massive mandate: lead America's efforts in all aeronautical and space activities. This mandate encompassed everything from developing advanced aircraft to the monumental goal of sending humans beyond Earth's atmosphere. NASA consolidated the country's fragmented efforts into a single, coordinated push for the stars. The agency inherited several key existing projects from its predecessor organizations, including the Explorer satellite program and the cutting-edge X-15 rocket plane, which explored the boundaries between atmosphere and space. Although NASA faced an uphill battle from the start, the Soviet Union still had a huge head start in rocketry. The foundation was finally laid. The agency was now organized, receiving funding, and most importantly, it had the critical initial success of Explorer 1 behind it. This collaborative approach, which included working with scientists from universities, military experts, and private industry partners, allowed NASA to begin making rapid progress in those crucial early years. The space race was intensifying, and America was finally ready to push the boundaries of human knowledge and capability in space. Chapter 2. Project Mercury, Alan Shepard and the first U.S. missions to space. Project Mercury began in 1958 under the newly formed NASA. The goal was perfectly clear: send an astronaut into orbit, bring them back safely, and in doing so, prove that the U.S. could actually compete with the Soviet Union in this intense new rivalry. They needed to show the world that American technology and American ingenuity were up to the immense challenge. The Soviets, however, were still dominating the news. They had shocked the world with Sputnik 1 and later with Sputnik 2, which carried the dog Laika, proving that a living organism could survive the stresses of launch and function in space. This achievement only heightened the pressure on the U.S. to achieve a human flight. NASA faced significant challenges from the start. Developing rockets reliable enough to safely carry humans to space was no small feat, especially since they were largely adapting existing military missile technology for space travel. That process was fraught with setbacks and failures. Simultaneously, scientists had to grapple with creating life support systems that could keep an astronaut alive in the harsh environment of space. Despite these hurdles, Project Mercury pressed forward, driven by the urgency of the Cold War rivalry. A critical part of this early program was selecting the men who would take on this incredibly dangerous mission. NASA carefully selected these individuals from a pool of elite military test pilots. They were looking for men who could handle the intense physical and mental demands of spaceflight. These astronauts became known collectively as the Mercury 7. They quickly transformed into symbols of American determination and ingenuity, their bravery inspiring the public and helping to rally support for the entire space program. Among this original group was Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, and the man who would take America's first flight, Alan Shepard. The Soviets achieved the monumental first human flight on April 12, 1961, when cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin launched aboard Vostok 1. Gagarin completed a single orbit around Earth, reaching speeds of 27,400 kilometers per hour. His mission lasted just 108 minutes, but it accomplished what had once seemed impossible. Humanity had achieved spaceflight. News of Gagarin's successful flight spread rapidly, cementing the Soviet Union's lead in the space race. The pressure on America was now even greater. They had to respond quickly. Less than a month after Gagarin's historic orbital flight, the United States was ready to send its own astronaut into space. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard was strapped into his tiny Freedom 7 spacecraft. His launch came after months of preparation, and the tension was palpable. As he prepared for liftoff, the calm command, "All systems are go," signaled that America was finally ready to make its move. Shepard completed a suborbital flight, meaning he didn't achieve the velocity needed to circle the Earth as Gagarin had. Instead, he soared up to an altitude of 187 kilometers before returning to Earth. The entire mission lasted only about 15 minutes. Though brief, this mission was a crucial step forward for the U.S. space program. Shepard's successful return demonstrated that a human could survive the physical demands of spaceflight. He was immediately welcomed home as a hero. However, the nature of the flight showed America was still playing catch-up. While Shepard's achievement was significant, it was overshadowed by the fact that the Soviets had already flown a human in a full orbit. President John F. Kennedy recognized immediately that if the United States was truly going to overtake the Soviet space program, a much bolder mission was necessary. Just weeks after Shepard's flight, Kennedy stood before Congress and made a monumental declaration that would forever change the trajectory of NASA and the nation. He announced a daring, ambitious goal. "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." Kennedy's choice of the moon as the ultimate destination was a calculated move. It represented the pinnacle of human exploration, a feat so audacious it would leave no doubt about America's capabilities and determination. The goal transformed the space race from merely a competition between rivals into a definitive quest for knowledge and human achievement. When Kennedy addressed Congress, the United States had just 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience, thanks entirely to Alan Shepard's short journey. No one knew if landing a man on the moon was even physically possible, let alone achievable, in just 9 years. It would be an unprecedented engineering and scientific undertaking, one that would eventually become known as the Apollo program. Project Mercury now had a purpose far beyond proving survival. It had to pave the way for the moon. NASA intensified its efforts, and the American public rallied behind the new goal. The Mercury program's next critical milestone came on February the 20th, 1962, when John Glenn made history as the first American to orbit Earth. Glenn's friendship. 7 mission lasted nearly 5 hours, during which he circled the planet 3 times. This achievement finally brought the United States closer to parity with the Soviet Union in the orbital aspect of the space race. Glenn instantly captivated the American public, transforming him into a national hero overnight. As Project Mercury progressed, each subsequent mission pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The program gradually extended the flight durations, culminating in Gordon Cooper's Faith 7 mission in May 1963. Cooper orbited Earth 22 times over 34 hours, demonstrating that humans could function effectively in space for extended periods of time. This duration finally brought the Americans close to the Soviet endurance record, set earlier by cosmonaut Gurman Titov's 25-hour flight on Vostok 2. These Mercury missions and the successful return of 6 astronauts to Earth proved that human spaceflight was not only possible, but could be reliably and repeatedly achieved. The program provided vital data on how the human body and mind cope with exposure to the space environment. The successful engineering, rigorous training, and increasing complexity of the Project Mercury missions laid the crucial groundwork for the more ambitious endeavors that would follow. The next stage of America's journey would be Project Gemini, designed specifically to master the new techniques, like docking and spacewalking, that were absolutely necessary for reaching the moon. The path to Apollo was now officially open. Chapter 3. President Kennedy's Promise. Committing the Nation to the Moon Goal. In 1961, at the height of the intense Cold War rivalry, the Soviet Union had already claimed the most prestigious title in space, First Man in Space. Just weeks before Alan Shepard's flight, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit Earth. Gagarin's mission lasted 108 minutes, an achievement that cemented the Soviet lead in the space race and was a major victory for the USSR in the quest for cosmic supremacy. The impact of these early Soviet successes, starting with Sputnik in 1957 and culminating with Gagarin's orbit, was profound. The launches were seen as a clear demonstration of Soviet technological prowess, and they raised serious concerns within the American government and among the public. The United States needed to make a bold move, something spectacular that would clearly reassert its technological strength and capture the world's imagination. President John F. Kennedy knew that the United States needed a mission far more ambitious than the short flights of Project Mercury if it was ever going to overtake the Soviet space program. The answer, he realized, wasn't just catching up. It was leaping ahead to a goal so audacious that it would leave no doubt about America's capabilities. The ultimate destination Kennedy chose was the moon. On May 25th, 1961, just weeks after Shepard's 15-minute flight, President Kennedy stood before Congress and made a monumental declaration that would forever change the trajectory of NASA and the nation. He announced a definitive, high-stakes commitment. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. This wasn't just a scientific objective. It was a powerful statement of national will and a direct challenge to the American spirit. The moon represented the absolute pinnacle of human exploration, a feat so daring it would silence any doubts about American technological superiority. Kennedy's choice transformed the space race from simply a competition between rivals into a definitive, all-consuming quest for human achievement. When Kennedy addressed Congress with this incredible challenge, the United States literally had just 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience. At that time, no one knew if a moon landing was even technically possible, let alone achievable, in the 9 short years left in the decade. It would require an unprecedented engineering and scientific undertaking, one marked by both heroism and, tragically, setbacks. The incredible task of landing an American astronaut on the moon became known as the Apollo program. This goal ignited a massive national effort. Suddenly, space exploration wasn't just a distant dream. It was a national mission, uniting the American public behind a singular, inspiring objective. NASA, which was still a very young agency at the time, was instantly thrust into the spotlight. Engineers and scientists immediately began working around the clock to develop the incredibly complex technologies needed for lunar missions. The project required the development of systems that could withstand the extreme conditions of space, push rudimentary computer systems to their very limits, and create life support systems capable of sustaining astronauts across hundreds of thousands of miles of cold, empty space. Before NASA could even begin designing the specific lunar spacecraft, it had to tackle fundamental questions about the how of the mission. How exactly would they manage to send astronauts to the moon? The most straightforward idea was to send a single, massive spacecraft from Earth all the way to the moon and back again. However, a spacecraft large enough to carry all the necessary equipment, supplies, and fuel for that entire round trip would require an impossibly huge rocket just to launch it off Earth. One of the men best placed to help answer these questions was NASA's top rocket scientist, Wernher von Braun. You'll remember von Braun from earlier, as he was the individual recruited through Operation Paperclip, who had spearheaded the V-2 rocket program during World War II. By 1960, he joined NASA as the first director of its Marshall Space Flight Center. Von Braun initially favored a different approach than the direct Earth-to-Moon flight. He suggested solving the size problem by launching the spacecraft in smaller pieces aboard several smaller rockets, and then assembling the entire structure in orbit around Earth. But even this plan still left the problem of how to land such a massive, combined spacecraft on the Moon's surface. The solution that NASA ultimately adopted came from an engineer named John Houbolt. He suggested a completely different option, one that was initially considered too dangerous by NASA's most senior leaders. Houbolt's plan involved sending not one, but two separate spacecraft joined together to the Moon. The first spacecraft was the Command and Service Module, or CSM. This part would act as the astronauts' home, providing fuel, power, supplies, and living space for the three crew members as they traveled to and from the Moon. The second spacecraft, the Lunar Excursion Module, or LEM, later just the Lunar Module, or LM, was the part specifically designed to land on the Moon. It would be piloted by two astronauts, while the third astronaut would remain behind in the CSM, orbiting the Moon. This two-part approach was crucial because the lunar module only needed the equipment and fuel necessary for the lunar landing and ascent back into orbit. It didn't need to withstand Earth's atmosphere. This meant the lunar module could be incredibly small and light. These huge savings in weight meant that the entire combined spacecraft could actually be launched successfully on a single, albeit very large, rocket. Von Braun eventually endorsed Houbolt's Lunar Orbital Rendezvous proposal. However, the plan was inherently high risk. It required NASA to invent entirely new piloting techniques, such as docking and undocking two separate spacecraft in the vacuum of space, and then executing those complex maneuvers flawlessly. If anything went wrong during the separation or redocking, the two astronauts on the Moon would have absolutely no hope of rescue. To pave the way for this complex lunar mission, NASA relied on the lessons and technological experience gained from the current space programs, Project Mercury and the successor, Project Gemini. The space flights of Mercury and Gemini were necessary to develop and perfect these new piloting techniques, such as performing spacewalks, mastering orbital maneuvers, and ensuring that astronauts could work and live effectively in space for long periods. President Kennedy's bold vision had transformed a technological rivalry into humanity's greatest adventure. While Kennedy himself didn't live to see the Apollo achievements, having been assassinated in 1963, his commitment set in motion the chain of events that would define an entire generation. The immense high-risk work of designing, building, and perfecting the spacecraft capable of carrying Americans to the Moon was now NASA's singular, unwavering focus. Chapter 4. Project Gemini. Mastering Rendezvous and Spacewalking Techniques. The promise had been made. President Kennedy had committed the nation to an incredibly audacious goal, landing a man on the Moon and bringing him back safely before the end of the decade. But when he made that promise in 1961, the United States had just 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience, thanks to Alan Shepard's brief suborbital journey. The simple, single astronaut flights of Project Mercury had only shown that a human could survive the launch and return to Earth. NASA simply wasn't ready to go to the moon yet. Before America could launch the massive Apollo missions, they needed an essential bridge program to master the incredibly complex and high-risk techniques absolutely necessary for a lunar landing. That crucial bridge was called Project Gemini, which began in 1961. Its entire existence was focused on developing and perfecting the skills vital for a successful lunar mission. The moon landing plan required a difficult dance in space, sending two spacecraft joined together, the Command and Service Module and the Lunar Module, and they would need astronauts who could execute complex aerial maneuvers far from home. Project Gemini's main goals were all crucial steps toward the moon. First, astronauts had to learn how to expertly maneuver and dock two spacecraft together while in orbit. This was necessary because the lunar module, carrying the landing crew, had to undock from the command module in lunar orbit, and then, after completing the moon mission, find and reconnect with the command module, which would be circling the moon. This specific maneuver was called Lunar Orbital Rendezvous, and it was initially considered far too dangerous by many of NASA's senior engineers. They knew that if anything went wrong during the separation or the redocking process, the two astronauts on the moon would have absolutely no hope of rescue. Second, astronauts had to prove they could handle long-duration spaceflight. A full trip to the moon and back would require the crew to spend many days, potentially even weeks, living and working in the cramped confines of a spacecraft, a duration far longer than the short flights of Project Mercury. Third, astronauts needed to master extravehicular activity, or EVA, which is commonly known as spacewalking. They needed to prove that a human could actually leave the protection of the capsule and perform manual work in the complete vacuum of space, which would be crucial for tasks like checking the exterior of the spacecraft or fixing equipment. In the early days of Gemini, America was still lagging behind its Cold War rival in the spacewalk department. The Soviet Union had achieved the first human spacewalk on March 18th, 1965. When cosmonaut Alexei Leonov stepped out of his Voskhod, two spacecraft and floated at the end of a tether for 12 minutes. Although his suit experienced problems that made it difficult for him to re-enter the airlock, the mission proved that humans could physically work in the vacuum of space. Just 3 months after Leonov's achievement, America successfully completed its first spacewalk during the Gemini 4 mission. On June 3, 1965, astronaut Ed White stepped out of his spacecraft and into the silent void. White floated at the end of a tether for 23 minutes, maneuvering with a handheld gas gun. This historic moment proved that Americans could also perform critical work outside their spacecraft, establishing an ability essential for the future moon missions. The next major obstacle Gemini had to master was the precision flying required for rendezvous and docking in orbit. This highly technical skill was the cosmic ballet needed to link two separate vehicles, traveling at speeds over 17,000 miles per hour. The critical test for this maneuver came in December 1965 with the combined missions of Gemini 6A and Gemini 7. The original plan for Gemini 6 involved using an unmanned target vehicle, but that vehicle unfortunately exploded shortly after liftoff, forcing NASA to quickly devise a new, daring plan. The new plan was that Gemini 6, commanded by Wally Schirra and piloted by Tom Stafford, would instead chase and rendezvous with Gemini 7, which was already in orbit. Gemini 7 had launched first, carrying astronauts Frank Borman and Jim Lovell. They were settled in for what would be a record-breaking, grueling 14-day endurance test, pushing the limits of human endurance and the spacecraft's life support systems. They lived in incredibly cramped quarters that were only about the size of the front seat of a small car. 3 days after Gemini 7 launched, the refurbished Gemini 6A finally lifted off. Using rudimentary computer systems and their own piloting skills, Schirra and Stafford successfully guided their craft toward the other spacecraft. After hours of careful maneuvering, the two capsules finally came within visual range of each other, flying in formation. The two spacecraft, each traveling at tremendous orbital speeds, ultimately came within just 1 foot of each other. Borman and Lovell, peering out of Gemini 7's tiny windows, could clearly see the faces of their fellow astronauts in Gemini 6A. This achievement was nothing short of historic. It proved unequivocally that spacecraft could find each other and maneuver precisely in the vastness of space. This capability was vital for the complex lunar missions to come, where the command module and lunar module would separate and then need to precisely reconnect in lunar orbit. While the rendezvous was a resounding success, Gemini 7 still had to complete its long-duration flight. Borman and Lovell successfully completed their mission, spending nearly 14 days orbiting the Earth. Their extended mission tested the astronauts' physical and mental endurance in the tiny capsule, providing crucial data on how the human body and mind cope with prolonged exposure to space. Their experiences proved that humans could effectively function in space for the long periods necessary for a trip to the moon. The final step in orbital control was full, hard docking, and it was achieved by Gemini 8. This mission, commanded by Neil Armstrong, made history on March 16, 1966, by achieving the first ever docking between two spacecraft in orbit. However, this mission also demonstrated the extreme dangers of space exploration. Shortly after docking, a faulty maneuvering thruster caused the combined spacecraft to enter a dangerous, wild spin. Armstrong's remarkable calm and swift piloting skills brought the spacecraft under control and saved the day, safely bringing the mission to an early but successful conclusion. This almost superhuman ability to remain composed under extreme pressure would later prove absolutely vital for Armstrong during the Apollo 11 moon landing mission. The successful missions of Project Gemini, which ran through 1966, achieved all of NASA's major objectives. The program had successfully perfected the ability to rendezvous, man dock in orbit, proved the endurance of astronauts and spacecraft during long missions, and mastered spacewalking techniques. In total, American astronauts flew 16 crewed missions across Project Mercury and Project Gemini in just 5 years, learning critical lessons about how to eat, sleep, work, and walk in space. These lessons were the absolutely necessary precursor to the Apollo program. With Gemini's successes, NASA was now ready to take the next, incredibly complex, giant leap toward fulfilling President Kennedy's bold vision. The high-risk path to the moon was now officially ready to be traveled. Chapter 5. The Apollo 1 Tragedy. Redesigning the command module for safety. The American space program, driven by President Kennedy's promise to land a man on the moon, had successfully moved through the pioneering phases of Project Mercury and Project Gemini. American astronauts had learned how to eat, sleep, work, and walk in space, and they'd mastered the vital skill of orbital rendezvous and docking. Everything was leading toward the immense undertaking known as the Apollo program, which was intended to fulfill Kennedy's commitment to reach the moon before the decade was out. But before the Apollo program could even launch its first crewed mission, it would face its darkest hour, a tragedy that cost 3 lives and temporarily halted America's drive toward the stars. The enormous pressure on NASA and its contractors to achieve the moon landing by 1970 led to a rush in the design and development of the incredibly complex Apollo spacecraft. Even after 5 years of development and testing, the spacecraft was known to be riddled with defects. The spacecraft that was supposed to carry the first Americans into orbit was the Apollo Command Module. On January 27, 1967, the crew of the first planned mission, Apollo 1, was sealed inside this module for a routine dress rehearsal of the launch countdown. This test was known as a plugs-out test, meaning the spacecraft was operating on its own internal power, simulating the exact conditions of a launch without the rocket being fueled. The 3 astronauts inside were Command Pilot Gus Grissom, Senior Pilot Ed White, and rookie astronaut Roger Chaffee. Grissom was one of America's most experienced astronauts, a member of NASA's first astronaut group, the Mercury 7, who had already flown into space aboard tiny 1-person capsules. Ed White was already a historic figure, having been the first American to walk in space during the Gemini program. Roger Chaffee was a former spy plane pilot who had flown reconnaissance missions during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right from the beginning of the test, things weren't going well. The crew struggled with constant communications problems between the capsule and the support teams in the control room, and Grissom was becoming frustrated. On previous ground tests, astronauts had already dealt with other serious issues like coolant leaks, problems with the plumbing in the environmental system, and numerous short circuits in the 20 miles of electrical wiring that filled the spacecraft. As the crew prepared to resume the countdown, they were suddenly cut short by a frightening alert. A voice called out, "Hey! We've got a fire in the cockpit!" Within moments, the command module was engulfed in flames, and all 3 astronauts were tragically killed. The disaster occurred while the spacecraft was still on the launch pad, surrounded by help, yet escape proved impossible. The atmosphere inside the cabin during the test was pure oxygen. While this atmosphere was beneficial in space, on the ground, it created an extremely dangerous environment. In pure oxygen, even materials that are normally fire-resistant burst instantly into flame, turning the capsule into an incinerator within seconds. The exact cause of the fire was never definitively determined, but investigators believed it was most likely a spark from damaged wiring somewhere in the lower equipment bay that ignited the flammable materials. The command module's poor design then compounded the disaster. The spacecraft's hatch was a heavy, multi-piece design that opened inwards. The pressure inside the capsule, rapidly building from the intense heat of the fire, sealed the inward opening hatch shut, making escape physically impossible for the trapped crew. Even if the pressure hadn't been an issue, the inner hatch was fixed in place with 6 large bolts, which had to be manually unscrewed with a wrench. This process would have taken precious minutes, which the astronauts didn't have. The loss of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee during a routine test on the ground, and not during a rocket launch or in orbit, was a devastating blow to NASA. The tragedy of Apollo 1 exposed critical flaws in the spacecraft's design and severe shortcomings in the safety culture of NASA and its contractors. The command module had been a tinderbox waiting to ignite. This disaster left NASA's public image in tatters, raising serious questions about the entire Apollo program and the feasibility of achieving the moon goal. In the wake of this disaster, NASA immediately put the Apollo program on hold and made a solemn commitment to fix the errors and redesign the entire Apollo spacecraft with safety as the unquestionable top priority. The intensive investigation revealed numerous critical issues, from the highly flammable nylon materials used throughout the cabin to the inadequate emergency procedures. The changes enacted were sweeping and fundamental, born from the sacrifice of the Apollo 1 crew. The highly flammable nylon materials used in the cabin and the astronauts' suits were swapped out for non-flammable, fire-resistant cloth. The extensive electrical wiring system was replaced with fireproof wiring. At launch, the capsule was pressurized with a safer oxygen-nitrogen mix instead of pure oxygen, reducing the immediate fire risk. Most crucially, the dangerous multi-piece inward opening hatch was completely redesigned. The new version, known as the improved Block 2 model, had a single-piece hatch that opened outward and could be opened in just 7 seconds in an emergency. The immense changes forced by the tragedy ultimately led to a much safer, more reliable spacecraft, saving lives in future missions by forcing NASA to correct critical flaws in its design. The focus then shifted to proving that the redesigned command and service module was sound. After a necessary series of successful uncrewed test flights, the next mission to carry American astronauts would be Apollo 7. The crew for Apollo 7, including mission commander Wally Schirra, had actually been the backup crew for the ill-fated Apollo 1 mission. Schirra, like Grissom, was a veteran of the original Mercury 7 astronaut corps. Their central mission was to give the newly redesigned Apollo spacecraft a thorough shakedown, testing every single system in the demanding environment of Earth orbit. The crew successfully put the spacecraft through its paces, performing navigation exercises and practicing the intricate docking maneuvers using their spent rocket booster as a target. Apollo 7 accomplished all of its demanding objectives, proving that the new command and service module was safe and reliable. The success of Apollo 7 meant the Apollo program was officially back on track. The groundwork was now laid for the true giant leaps to come, including the unprecedented journey that would take the next crew far beyond Earth's reach and into lunar orbit. Chapter 6. The mighty Saturn V, carrying Americans to lunar orbit on Apollo 8. After the tragedy of Apollo 1 and the necessary redesign of the command module, the American space program slowly found its footing again. The successful Earth orbit mission of Apollo 7 proved that the new, safer spacecraft, the Block 2 model, was reliable. Now, NASA needed to take the next enormous step toward fulfilling President Kennedy's promise. That next step required a rocket unlike anything built before. The plan to land on the moon, the one that used the Lunar Orbital Rendezvous technique, still needed a launch vehicle powerful enough to lift the heavy command module, the service module, and the lunar module up off Earth and send them on a journey of nearly 240,000 miles. This vehicle was the Saturn V rocket. Traveling to the moon required the largest rocket NASA had ever designed. This colossal machine, standing over 110 meters tall, dwarfed all previous American rockets. It was taller than a 36-story building. Designed by the team led by the German-born rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, the Saturn V was the ultimate workhorse of the Apollo program. The Saturn V was built in 3 separate stages, each firing sequentially to push the spacecraft further and faster. The first stage was the mighty Foundation, equipped with 5 enormous F-1 engines. These engines burned through 500,000 gallons of kerosene and liquid oxygen in just 2.5 minutes, delivering an incredible combined thrust of 7.5 million pounds. This power was needed just to lift the colossal mass of the spacecraft against Earth's gravity. The second and third stages of the rocket took over once the first stage was jettisoned. They carried the spacecraft first to Earth orbit, and then finally delivered the push needed to send the capsule onwards to the Moon. The sheer scale of the Saturn V symbolized America's determination to complete the incredible engineering task set before the nation. As engineers worked to perfect this massive machine, the geopolitical pressure of the Cold War continued to mount. In April 1968, a CIA report suggested that the Soviet Union was preparing to send cosmonauts on a circumnavigation mission around the Moon. America simply couldn't allow the Soviets to beat them to another historic first. To preempt this move, NASA decided on a daring change of plan. Apollo 8, which was originally intended as a simple test of the lunar module in Earth orbit, would instead be sent on an unprecedented mission to orbit the Moon. The furthest any human had traveled from Earth's surface until then was only 850 miles. Apollo 8's crew would travel an astonishing 240,000 miles from home, entering an environment where there would be absolutely no hope of rescue if their spacecraft failed. The crew chosen for this high-stakes mission were Commander Frank Borman, Command Module Pilot Jim Lovell, and Lunar Module Pilot Bill Anders. Borman was an Air Force colonel, a test pilot, and an aeronautical engineer. Lovell knew Borman intimately, as they had spent a record-breaking and grueling 14 days orbiting the Earth together in the tiny Gemini 7 spacecraft, proving that humans could endure long-duration spaceflight. Anders's job was to survey the Moon's surface, searching for suitable landing sites for the future missions. On December 21st, 1968, Borman, Lovell, and Anders became the first astronauts to ride the mighty Saturn V rocket. The powerful blast-off was a success, and after a 3-day journey through the void of space, Apollo 8 arrived at its destination. When Apollo 8 reached the Moon, the crew had to execute an extremely precise maneuver, firing their large SPS engine to slow down and be captured by the Moon's gravity. If the engine didn't fire for exactly the correct amount of time, the spacecraft could crash into the Moon or be uncontrollably hurled into deep space. As the spacecraft passed around the far side of the Moon, the astronauts became the first humans to lose direct contact with Earth. Their radio signals were completely blocked by the lunar surface, and the staff at Mission Control in Houston waited nervously for news. Borman, Lovell, and Anders were the first humans to view the lunar surface up close. Over the next 20 hours, Apollo 8 completed 10 orbits around the Moon. They provided detailed descriptions of the stark beauty and desolate appearance of the lunar surface, gathering crucial data that would pave the way for Apollo 11's later touchdown. But the most incredible thing they saw wasn't the Moon at all. It was their home planet. On the third orbit, Bill Anders captured one of history's most remarkable photos, Earthrise. This image showed our planet, a small blue marble suspended in the blackness of space, rising above the bleak lunar horizon. The photograph was peaceful and breathtaking, and it became one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. It offered the world a brand new perspective on our fragile place in the cosmos. This mission took place at the end of 1968, which had been a difficult year for the United States, marked by deep national division, the war in Vietnam, and the assassinations of both Martin Luther King, Jr. and Robert Kennedy. For NASA and the nation, the success of Apollo 8 brought much-needed hope. On Christmas Eve, as millions of people around the world tuned in, the Apollo 8 crew made a live television broadcast directly from lunar orbit. In a moment that resonated across cultures and beliefs, the astronauts read the first 10 verses from the Book of Genesis. Borman closed the broadcast with a message of hope, sharing his wish for peace and a Merry Christmas to all people on the good earth. The success of Apollo 8 demonstrated the feasibility of navigating to the moon and returning safely. It proved that the colossal Saturn V rocket could deliver astronauts to lunar orbit, and that the spacecraft systems could function reliably in deep space. The mission provided invaluable experience in the complex maneuvers required for lunar orbit insertion and trans-Earth injection. After 7 years of intense research, NASA had flown 3 astronauts 240,000 miles from home and into lunar orbit. Apollo 8 flew within 69 miles of the moon's surface. For the first time, it seemed truly possible that NASA might meet President Kennedy's ambitious goal and land an astronaut on the moon before the end of the decade. But crossing that final small gap would be the greatest challenge of the Apollo program, one that still required a completely new and untested type of spacecraft, the lunar module. Chapter 7. Final tests, proving the lunar module's readiness for descent. The year 1968 closed with the incredible success of Apollo 8, a mission that had carried 3 American astronauts to the moon and brought them safely back home. This journey proved that the colossal Saturn V rocket and the redesigned command and service module were capable of traveling the 240,000 miles necessary for the lunar journey. The mission gave America and the world its first look at the stark beauty of the lunar surface and the iconic image of Earthrise. However, crossing that final small gap to the moon's surface would be the single greatest challenge of the Apollo program. It required a completely new and, as yet, untested type of spacecraft, the lunar module. The lunar module, or LM, was the crucial second part of the 2-spacecraft plan for the lunar landing. It was designed only to fly in the vacuum of space. This meant it didn't need the aerodynamic streamlining or the heavy heat shields required for travel through Earth's atmosphere. Engineers knew that every panel, bolt, and button had to be as light as possible so the craft could lift itself off the moon's surface after the landing. Because of its unusual insect-like appearance, one astronaut said it looked like cellophane and tin foil put together with Scotch tape and staples. The high-risk nature of the lunar landing plan meant that the command module, which contained the only heat shield, would have to remain in orbit around the moon, piloted by one astronaut. The 2 astronauts who descended in the lunar module would have no hope of rescue if they couldn't successfully redock with the command module after their surface mission. Because of this inherent danger, NASA had to test and perfect the lunar module systems in Earth orbit before any landing attempt could be made. In the wake of Apollo 8's daring journey to the moon, the next flight, Apollo 9, received far less public attention. The mission wasn't even going to leave Earth orbit. But within the astronaut corps, the first crewed flight of the lunar module was seen as an even more exciting challenge. The mission commander, Jim McDivitt, had actually turned down the chance to fly to the moon on Apollo 8 choosing Apollo 9 instead. Like many Apollo astronauts, he was a former test pilot, and this was his opportunity to test a brand new flying machine. Before the critical test flight of the lunar module could begin, the crew had a challenging maneuver to perform right after launch. The lunar module was folded inside the upper stage of the Saturn V rocket and needed to be extracted using the command and service module. McDivitt and his crew successfully performed this docking maneuver. After that, McDivitt and lunar module pilot Rusty Schweikart climbed aboard their lander, which they had given the call sign Spider. They undocked from the command module, which they called Gumdrop, leaving command module pilot Dave Scott behind to fly the command and service module. The crew then flew the lunar module over 100 miles away from the command module. This was a crucial test that demonstrated the lander's ability to operate completely independently in space. They tested both the ascent and descent engines, proving that the crew could safely navigate the small spacecraft and then fire the ascent stage, which would be necessary to get off the moon's surface. After these complex maneuvers, they successfully returned for a safe rendezvous and docking with the command module. The Apollo 9 mission proved that the critical lunar module was ready to fly to the moon. However, even with the successful testing of both the command module on Apollo 7 and the lunar module on Apollo 9, many critical unknowns remained before a safe landing could be attempted. NASA needed more experience in communications and tracking two separate spacecraft in lunar orbit. Plus, there were the challenges of rendezvous and docking in the moon's weaker gravitational environment. There was another critical unknown that posed a major risk. In 1968, NASA scientists discovered that the moon has a highly uneven gravitational field. This unevenness is caused by huge lumps of high-density material in its crust, known as mass concentrations or mascons. These mascons could exert an uneven pull on a spacecraft, potentially throwing it off course during the final descent. Before it was safe to attempt a landing, NASA would need to learn more about the mascons by examining their effect on another Apollo flight. Because of these remaining concerns, NASA decided that the next mission, Apollo 10, would be a full dress rehearsal for the first landing attempt. The crew would fly every single part of the mission, except for the final descent to the lunar surface. The Apollo 10 crew was Commander Tom Stafford, Command Module Pilot John Young, and Lunar Module Pilot Gene Cernan. All three men were veterans of the Gemini program, and with 5 missions between them, they were the most experienced crew ever sent into space up to that point. Stafford and Cernan entered the lunar module and flew it down to within just 9 miles of the moon's surface. This close approach demonstrated that the command module, the lunar module, and all their systems could operate successfully in the intense environment of lunar orbit. The crew successfully tested the radar, navigation, and landing procedures that Apollo 11 would soon use. The close flyby also allowed them to conduct reconnaissance, confirming the precise location of the primary landing site, which was known as the Sea of Tranquility. Their successful flight proved every phase of the mission, confirming that the high-risk lunar orbital rendezvous plan was viable. The success of Apollo 10 eliminated the remaining technical doubts about the spacecraft's functionality. Now, engineers, astronauts, and flight directors were confident that the mighty Saturn V, the command module, and the delicate lunar module were all ready for the final, defining step. After years of intense effort and numerous challenging tests, everything was finally in place. It was time to attempt the first moon landing. Chapter 8. Tranquility Base, fulfilling the promise of Apollo 11. After years of intense effort, profound tragedy, and numerous challenging test missions, including the crucial dress rehearsal of Apollo 10, everything was finally in place. It was time for the United States to attempt the greatest human adventure ever imagined, fulfilling President Kennedy's bold promise to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. The mission, of course, was Apollo 11. The eyes of the world were turned toward Cape Kennedy, Florida, as 3 brave American astronauts prepared to embark on a journey that would redefine humanity's place in the cosmos. The commander of this historic mission was Neil Armstrong, a brilliant engineer and test pilot. Early in his career with NASA, he had flown the experimental X-15 rocket plane at speeds of almost 4,000 miles per hour. Armstrong had already proven his almost superhuman ability to remain calm under pressure during the Gemini 8 mission, where he saved the spacecraft from a catastrophic failure caused by a spinning thruster. This ability would prove vital in the minutes to come. Joining him as the lunar module pilot was Buzz Aldrin. Aldrin was a graduate of MIT and had written his doctoral thesis on piloting techniques for orbital rendezvous. He possessed an extraordinary understanding of orbital mechanics, and he had proven his expertise during his Gemini 12 flight when his spacecraft's rendezvous radar malfunctioned. He was able to compute the orbital maneuvers himself and successfully guide the capsule to a safe docking. The third member of the crew was Michael Collins, the command module pilot. His critical assignment was to remain aboard the command modules, which they called Columbia, while Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the moon. Collins often told reporters that he was going 99.9% of the way there, and that was fine with him. However, he would later recount his greatest fear, which was that Armstrong and Aldrin would somehow be stranded on the surface, forcing him to travel back to Earth alone. The launch date was July 16th, 1969. Leading up to that day, almost 1 million people were gathering at Cape Kennedy to watch the astronauts fly to the moon. But the atmosphere wasn't purely celebratory. As launch preparations were made, around 150 people, mostly African-American mothers and their children, arrived at the launch site to protest. They were led by the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, who had succeeded Dr. Martin Luther King as the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Their message was simple. It was inhumane to spend billions of dollars sending men to the moon while 1 in 5 Americans lacked proper food, shelter, and health care. NASA Administrator Thomas Paine met with the protesters the evening before the launch. Paine explained to Abernathy that if they could solve the problems of poverty by simply not pushing the button to launch men to the moon, they wouldn't push that button. Their meeting resolved nothing, but it ended with a handshake and a promise by Abernathy that he would pray for the safe flight of the astronauts. The following day, 10 of the protesters were even invited into the VIP stands to watch the launch of Apollo 11. At 9:32 a.m. Eastern Time, the enormous Saturn V rocket thundered into the Florida sky. This massive machine, standing taller than a 36-story building, was the most powerful rocket ever built and the ultimate result of years of research and dedication. After a successful liftoff, the journey to the moon would take 4 days. Like all Apollo missions, Apollo 11 was carefully managed from the Mission Operations Control room, which everyone knew as Mission Control, in Houston, Texas. Teams of flight controllers worked round the clock, overseeing the spacecraft's trajectory and every one of its onboard systems. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into their lunar module, which they had named Eagle. They undocked and began their descent to the lunar surface. Armstrong's voice crackled through the radio, confirming that the lunar module had wings. Years of hard work and training had led to this moment, and the descent to the lunar surface would test their skills to the absolute limit. Back on Earth, the staff of Mission Control watched as Eagle passed behind the moon for a final time. They monitored every system in both spacecraft, guiding the astronauts through the complex flight plan. Then the tension ratcheted up when the success of the mission suddenly rested on the shoulders of a 26-year-old guidance officer named Steve Bales. The master alarm sounded in the lunar module cockpit, signaling that something was wrong. The simple display showed the numbers 1202, but neither Armstrong nor Aldrin knew exactly what this code meant. Flight Director Gene Kranz was seconds away from calling an abort, so he turned to Bales for answers. The alarm meant the guidance computer was overloaded. It had too many tasks to complete in its computing cycle and was dropping some in order to continue functioning. Without a working guidance computer, the astronauts would have been forced to abort the landing. But the alarm wasn't sounding continuously. This meant that most computational cycles were still being completed properly. Bales made the critical decision that as long as the problem was only intermittent, the landing could continue. The controller relayed the information, and the landing was given a go. However, there was another problem almost immediately. The lunar module was approaching the surface too fast, and the computer had overshot its intended landing site. The computer was now guiding the lunar module toward a massive football stadium-sized crater, surrounded by a field of car-sized boulders. With the lunar module almost out of fuel, Armstrong took manual control. Mission Control could only watch, knowing that the success of the landing now rested entirely on Armstrong's piloting skills. As Armstrong expertly guided the fragile craft over the hazardous terrain, the fuel gauges dropped lower and lower. Finally, with almost no fuel remaining, the landing probes touched the surface, and the contact light came on. Armstrong's calm voice crackled through millions of radios and televisions back on Earth. Tranquility base here. The Eagle has landed. An estimated 600 million people watched the moonwalk on television. Families gathered around their television sets, and even New York's Times Square fell silent as humanity witnessed this historic moment together. As his boot touched the powdery lunar surface, Armstrong uttered the immortal words that it was one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Aldrin joined Armstrong on the surface, and together they spent over 2 hours exploring this alien world. They collected rock samples, set up scientific experiments, and took photographs. The lunar module carried a plaque that was later placed on the leg that read that men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon in July 1969, and that they came in peace for all mankind. This powerful sentiment captured the mission's significance, not just as an American achievement, but as a defining milestone for all of humanity. The raising of the American flag was a symbol of the nation's technological triumph and the fulfillment of President Kennedy's daring promise. The Apollo 11 crew returned home as heroes, their names now forever etched amongst those of the greatest explorers in history. They brought back not only moon rocks and scientific data, but a brand new perspective on our planet. The sight of Earth from space, a small blue marble in the vastness of space, underscored the fragility and unity of our world. President Kennedy's goal had been accomplished. The Apollo 11 mission showcased the incredible technological achievements of the space race and the triumph of American ingenuity. But now that the immediate political goal was met, interest in space exploration began to fade. NASA's budget was severely slashed, meaning there would only be resources for 6 more lunar flights. The new mission for the remaining Apollo flights would shift completely to science, trying to unlock the mysteries of the moon's origins. Chapter 9. The Successful Failure. Surviving the Apollo 13, Crisis and Final Science. After the incredible success of Apollo 11, America had fulfilled President Kennedy's promise to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. The technological feat was astounding, but once the main political goal was accomplished, interest in space exploration began to fade. As a result, NASA's budget was severely slashed, meaning there would only be resources for 6 more lunar flights. The new mission for the remaining Apollo flights would shift completely to science, trying to unlock the mysteries of the moon's origins and understand the story of the early solar system. The third lunar landing attempt, Apollo 13, marked this shift toward scientific discovery. While previous missions had largely been test flights of the spacecraft, Apollo 13 would focus on gathering scientific data. It was scheduled to land at the Fra Mauro Highlands, an ancient terrain that engineers believed could provide insight into the very origins of the solar system. The mission patch for Apollo 13 featured the Latin words ex luna, scientia, which translates to from the moon, knowledge. The mission commander was veteran astronaut Jim Lovell, who had traveled further and spent more time in space than any other astronaut at that time. He was already a hero, having flown on Gemini 7 with Frank Borman, Gemini 12 with Buzz Aldrin, and his trip around the moon on Apollo 8. He was joined by 2 rookie astronauts, Lunar Module pilot Fred Hayes and Command Module pilot Ken Mattingly. However, just 2 days before launch, Mattingly was exposed to German measles and replaced by another astronaut, Jack Swigert. This last-minute change was a difficult blow for a crew that had trained so intensely together. Despite the change, the mission launched on April 11th, 1970. The flight was extremely normal for the first couple of days. 2 days, 7 hours, and 46 minutes into the mission, the Apollo 13 crew had just completed a live television broadcast on their way to the moon. Because public interest in the Apollo program was already fading, no U.S. television network would even carry their show. As the astronauts packed away their camera equipment, they began a few routine housekeeping procedures. Mission Control then radioed the command to stir the cryogenic oxygen tanks. The command and service module was powered by 3 fuel cells that generated electricity by mixing hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen was stored as a very cold liquid in 2 storage tanks. The reason for stirring the tanks was that in 0 gravity, the temperature and density of the liquid oxygen could become uneven, making it difficult to accurately measure how much was left. The solution was simply to stir the liquid oxygen with a fan. When Jack Swigert turned that fan on, disaster struck. During a ground test just a few weeks earlier, a heater inside oxygen tank number 2 had been accidentally left on, baking its interior to over 500 degrees Celsius. This intense heat had damaged the Teflon insulation around the wires leading to the fan. When Swigert flipped the switch, electrical current arced across those damaged wires, starting a fire. The immense pressure of the expanding gas turned the oxygen tank into a bomb. The crew immediately knew they had a problem, and Jim Lovell radioed the chilling news. "Houston, we've had a problem." Lovell then glanced out the side window of the command module, and he saw that they were venting gas of some sort. Their second oxygen tank had also been damaged in the blast, and was quickly bleeding its contents into space. Without oxygen, the astronauts would soon have nothing left to breathe, let alone to generate electricity for their life support systems. Faced with the deadliest perils of spaceflight, the staff at Mission Control frantically worked to understand what had happened to the spacecraft. They quickly realized there was only one chance for survival. Apollo 13's lunar module, which they called Aquarius, still had its own oxygen, fuel, and a descent engine that could be used to put them on a course back to Earth. The astronauts had no choice but to use the lunar module as a lifeboat. The crew had to shut down the command module, which they called Odyssey, to preserve its tiny reserve of battery power for re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. All three men then climbed into the two-person lunar module. Conditions were incredibly cramped and bitterly cold. NASA staff in Mission Control worked around the clock to solve countless engineering and navigation problems that put the astronauts' lives in constant danger. One of the most serious problems they faced was stopping the astronauts from being poisoned by their own exhaled carbon dioxide. The lunar module used round canisters of lithium hydroxide to filter carbon dioxide from the air, but there weren't enough of these canisters to support 3 astronauts for the entire trip back. The command module used a similar system, but those canisters were square-shaped. Ingenuity saved the day. NASA staff, remembering a procedure developed for Apollo 8, quickly relayed instructions to the crew to build a makeshift air purifier. The device was cobbled together out of cardboard, tape, and an astronaut's sock, using the command module's square canisters. It worked perfectly, successfully removing the poisonous carbon dioxide from the cabin's atmosphere. Having survived the treacherous flight back to Earth, the crew faced the terrifying prospect of re-entry into the atmosphere. They climbed back into the dark and freezing command module and jettisoned Aquarius, the lunar module lifeboat, which wouldn't survive re-entry. Lovell bade farewell to the lunar module, thanking it for saving their lives. The command module had been powered down and left in freezing conditions for days. There were fears that its heat shield might have cracked when the oxygen tank exploded, or that the parachutes might have frozen solid. The astronauts were expected to be out of radio contact with Houston for 4 agonizing minutes during the re-entry blackout period. But 4 minutes passed, then 5, with no word from the crew. Finally, after 6 agonizing minutes, Odyssey reappeared, and the astronauts' voices crackled through the speakers. They had survived. Apollo 13 failed to land on the moon, but against all the odds, and through incredible determination and ingenuity on the ground and in space, NASA brought Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert home safely. The mission became known forever after as the successful failure. After the Apollo 13 close call, NASA engineers reinforced the necessity of rigorous safety standards and contingency planning. The intense focus on problem-solving under pressure demonstrated the value of the rigorous training given to both the astronauts and the mission control staff. Despite the near catastrophe, the focus quickly returned to science. The final chapter of the Apollo program would see its greatest scientific discoveries. These final 3 missions were the most scientifically productive, equipped with advanced hardware. The upgraded lunar modules carried enough supplies to support astronauts for 3 days, and new spacesuits and backpacks enabled spacewalks as long as 7 hours. Crucially, the later missions brought the new lunar rover, which allowed astronauts to explore much larger areas of the moon's surface. This final trio of missions included Apollo 14, commanded by returning hero Alan Shepard, who was the first American in space. Shepard successfully achieved a pinpoint, landing and ventured further from his lunar module than previous astronauts. Apollo 15, commanded by Dave Scott, made one of the biggest geological discoveries of the program when they unearthed a chunk of anorthosite, a piece of the moon's primordial crust that was 4.5 billion years old. Apollo 17, the final flight, prepared to depart on December the 7th, 1972. The launch was the only night launch of a Saturn V rocket, and its blazing exhaust plume lit up the sky. The crew included Harrison Schmitt, a professional geologist who was the only scientist astronaut to walk on the moon. Schmitt and Commander Gene Cernan spent a total of 22 hours walking on the moon, traveling 19 miles across its surface with the lunar rover, and collected more scientific data than any other mission. Cernan and Schmitt would be the last humans to walk on the moon in the 20th century. As the Apollo program came to an end in 1972, NASA was already preparing for new adventures in spaceflight that would focus on long-term presence and international cooperation. Chapter 10. The Next Era. From Orbital Handshakes to the Artemis Return. The final steps of the Apollo program were taken in 1972 when Commander Gene Cernan and astronaut geologist Harrison Schmitt departed the moon on Apollo 17, concluding humanity's great adventure of the 20th century. Cernan was the last person to have set foot on the moon as of June 2021. As he climbed back into the lunar module at the end of the mission, he bade farewell to the moon, sharing his hope that humans would soon return. With the Apollo program complete, the immediate political goal of beating the Soviets to the moon was achieved. The space race, which had propelled so much ingenuity and competition, was beginning to cool down. Both nations soon began to see the immense benefits of actually working together in space. This shift in attitude away from fierce competition and toward collaboration ushered in a new era of space exploration. The first true signs of this shift came in the mid-1970s, as NASA was preparing for new adventures in spaceflight, including the first U.S. space station, Skylab, which would launch in 1973. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had already launched Salyut-1, the world's first space station, in 1971. These orbital outposts were designed to allow cosmonauts and astronauts to spend months in space, conducting scientific experiments and pushing the limits of human endurance. The pivotal moment that symbolized the end of the space race came in 1975 with the Apollo-Soyuz test project. This historic mission brought together the United States and the Soviet Union in a spectacular display of international cooperation. The groundbreaking endeavor involved the complex docking of an American Apollo spacecraft with a Soviet Soyuz spacecraft in orbit, a feat that would have seemed completely impossible just a few years earlier. The mission crews represented the best of both nations. The U.S. crew included astronaut Tom Stafford, and the Soviet crew was led by cosmonaut Alexei Leonov. These men, who were once fierce competitors in the race to space, now worked together toward a single common goal. One of the biggest technical challenges was overcoming the differences between the two countries' spacecraft systems, requiring engineers from both sides to collaborate on creating a compatible docking mechanism. The result was the Apollo docking mechanism, a true testament to international collaboration. On July 17, 1975, the world watched as the two spacecraft successfully docked in orbit. When the hatches opened and the crews met face to face, it symbolized much more than just a technical achievement. The handshake between Stafford and Leonov, broadcast live around the world, became an iconic image of cooperation, transcending political differences and marking the symbolic end of the space race era. Over the next 2 days, the combined crews conducted joint experiments and shared meals, demonstrating that peaceful cooperation in space was not only possible, but highly beneficial for scientific progress. The success of the Apollo-Soyuz test project had enormous implications, proving that space exploration could serve as a powerful platform for unity, even during times of geopolitical tension on Earth. The mission laid the essential groundwork for future international partnerships, including the Shuttle Mir program and, eventually, the International Space Station. Following the final Apollo flight in 1972, NASA ushered in the next era of American spaceflight with the Space Shuttle program. The first flight of the reusable Space Shuttle came in 1981, commanded by Apollo astronaut John Young. The Space Shuttle would serve as America's primary vehicle for crewed spaceflight for 30 years, performing functions like deploying satellites and maintaining the new orbital platforms. The legacy of cooperation that began with Apollo-Soyuz grew into the grandest partnership in human history, the International Space Station, or ISS. Planning for the ISS began in the 1980s, bringing together major space agencies from around the globe, including NASA, the Russian space agency Roscosmos, the European Space Agency, the Japanese Space Agency JAXA, and the Canadian Space Agency. The ISS began to take shape in 1998. Today, it is the largest human-made object in orbit, a testament to human ingenuity and collaboration, with astronauts and cosmonauts from various nations living and working together high above the Earth. The ISS functions as a floating laboratory where researchers study everything from the human body's adaptation to microgravity to the testing of technologies essential for deep space exploration, like water recycling and oxygen generation. As the 21st century began, another revolutionary shift occurred: the rise of the private space industry. This new era was spearheaded by companies like SpaceX, founded by Elon Musk in 2002 with the ambitious goal of reducing the cost of space travel and eventually paving the way for the colonization of Mars. SpaceX achieved historic milestones by focusing on innovation, particularly the development of reusable rocket technology. In 2015, the company successfully landed its Falcon 9 booster after launch, a feat many experts had thought impossible. This achievement dramatically reduced the cost of access to space. The culmination of their efforts in human spaceflight came in 2020 with the launch of the Crew Dragon spacecraft carrying NASA astronauts to the ISS. This mission restored America's ability to launch astronauts from its own soil, a capability that had been lost after the Space Shuttle's retirement in 2011. The success of commercial partners has fostered a new model for space exploration, combining public sector goals with private sector efficiency. This collaboration is vital for NASA's Artemis program, the agency's renewed commitment to return to the Moon. Announced in 2019, the Artemis program aims to return humans to the lunar surface, but with a new vision that goes far beyond the brief visits of the Apollo era. The goal is to establish a sustainable human presence on our celestial neighbor, paving the way for even bolder explorations to Mars and beyond. The program intends to land the first woman and the first person of color on the Moon. Artemis embraces global collaboration, partnering with space agencies from around the world. At its core are two key components: the Massive Space Launch System, or SLS, designed to be the most powerful rocket ever built, and the Orion spacecraft, which will carry astronauts safely through deep space. Artemis 1 successfully launched as an uncrewed test flight in 2022, demonstrating the capabilities of the SLS and Orion. The ultimate goal is Artemis 3, the mission that will finally return humans to the lunar surface. The history of the American space race began with intense competition and Cold War rivalry, but it has evolved into an era defined by shared effort and global exploration. The ambition to explore space is no longer solely an American or a Russian goal. It's a shared human aspiration, moving toward a sustainable presence on the Moon, and eventually the development of technologies for the first crewed missions to Mars. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey through the history of the American space race. If you found comfort here, if this story helped you relax, please take a moment to like this video. It helps more than you might realize, especially with how the YouTube algorithm decides what to share with others. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, calm explorations of America's past, told slowly for rest and reflection, consider subscribing. I'll be posting new videos every week, so you'll always have another story waiting for you at bedtime. Now, settle in, knowing this journey among the stars is complete. The echoes of the American space race linger in our skies, in our memories, and in the quiet lessons of human curiosity and courage. Sleep well, and may your dreams drift gently among the stars that once inspired a nation to reach beyond itself. And if you're still awake, that's all right too. Let your breathing slow, let your body rest, and know that the next story will be here waiting for you soon.